Now I'd like to welcome Russell Greene, Senior Fellow at Stand Together. He's the author, among many other fascinating works, of the recent Law and Liberty article, What Are the Aims of Business? Welcome to Free the Economy, Russ.
Thank you, Richard. You're too kind.
Now, there has been a lot of talk in recent years about topics like corporate social responsibility and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG theory, which calls for businesses to adopt some loftier purposes than just making money. Do businesses actually need a lofty purpose? And are they at a moral or political disadvantage if they don't have one?
Two questions. Yeah. So let's answer the first. Do businesses need a lofty purpose? Just currently, right now, legally, they do not. Um, and I would also argue that morally, they do not. That if somebody wants to start a business, they want to start a pizza shop or a coffee shop or a new tech company, and they just want to make a lot of money for themselves and for their investors, and maybe even for their employees. There's nothing wrong with that, I don't think, and you're legally permitted to do it. Now, to your second question, though, is it sort of politically feasible or socially feasible? That's sort of a harder question to answer, and it's really at the heart of this debate. Um, the stakeholder versus shareholder debate, some people call it, or the debate over ESG. It's really around this idea of social responsibility and whether businesses, and usually people mean all businesses, although they very often focus on the largest ones, whether they have a responsibility, above and beyond, earning returns for their investors. I would say that I think it's increasingly difficult in the United States as a very large company to really ignore all of the pressures to do things like ESG and to engage in, at least the rhetoric of stakeholder capitalism.
Interesting. Now, when it comes to corporate virtue and ESG, even a lot of ESG advocates themselves lament the lack of a clear definition as to what that phrase covers or what it entails. Is there any objective way to say whether any given company has or hasn't embraced an ESG outlook?
Um, Objectively, well, the first thing you would look to is rating companies, like ESG rating companies. And as you, as an ESG expert, probably know, there's very little consistency among the various sources of ESG ratings. So something you might also look for would be, whether they've signed some of the notable ESG related commitments, such as a net zero commitment. But even then, it's not an objective ESG standard in the sense that a company might be very good on, say, renewable energy, by ESG standards, but fall short on other aspects of ESG. So, I think we all probably remember Elon Musk complaining about how ExxonMobil actually had a higher ESG score than Tesla. And it doesn't make sense if you assume that ESG is just about carbon dioxide emissions or the transition to renewable energy and electric cars. But it does make sense if you understand that ESG is actually trying to put together apples and oranges in a way that doesn't always make sense.
Hmm. One of the criticisms that we've had from people who are sort of some of the people who would be most in favor of responsible or enlightened or sustainable business practices of ESG metrics and standards is that they are greenwashing, which is to say that they are commitments or practices that pretend to be doing something good for the environment, for example, but are actually very shallow commitments, or they're not, they're not substantive or important. So there's one that I think is quite of interesting, maybe relatable to the average person who doesn't know a lot about industrial engineering and CO2 emissions. If you've stayed at any American hotel for probably the last decade or so, you've probably seen a little laminated card in your hotel room that says, if you would like to have your bed changed every day, or if you would like to have your towels fresh every day, put out this little plastic card and we'll do that. Otherwise, we won't, because we're committed to not using too much water and energy. So big hotel companies will say, oh, well, we're environmentally sensitive and green because we're not using too much water and detergent. On the other hand, you could say, well, the only reason they're doing that is to save money on housekeeping costs and their own bottom line.
Yeah.
So one, I guess the question is how much of ESG commitments are actually sort of self-interested greenwashing on the part of companies, but also, does it matter if, for example, Marriott does in fact use less energy and less detergent? Does it matter that they're also saving money?
Right. You could almost argue that's a win-win, right? Like the way, some libertarians talk about this issue, you would think that there's, essentially that ESG is a libertarian response to, basically social concerns around the environment and social issues, right? The argument would go basically that they found a way to, both achieve environmental goals and shareholder value at the same time. What I think that argument sort of misses, although it is encapsulating some of the reality, is how that, this is really larger than just what Marriott or any one company does. A lot of what's happening with ESG is happening above the level of corporate management, so above the CEO. We're talking about decisions being made by boards, and not just by boards, but by institutional investors, the world's largest asset managers. So there's really not just a company level, but an economic systems level dimension to this. What I think is really interesting, though, about the question you raise is how it's kind of impossible to answer, right? Because we're really getting at the question of human intention, human motivation. And it's not always even apparent to the individual, his or herself, what their motivation is. People can lie to them, lie to themselves about what's really motivating them. So it's almost an impossible question to answer. What I would say, though, what's become apparent to me, though, is that either the left wing critique, which is greenwashing, or the right wing critique, which is sort of that ESG is collusion among the world's largest companies and governments to sort of withhold capital from politically incorrect aspects of the economy. Generally, either one of those critiques is going to obtain, right? It's sort of a spectrum in between, you've got the greenwashing critique of ESG, which, as you articulated, that would be people like Tariq Fancy, who's a former BlackRock executive. Essentially they're saying that this is all smoke. None of these companies are doing anything differently than they would be under a pure shareholder primacy framework. They're just trying to make money. And there is some evidentiary support for that. You've got guys like Lucian Bebchuk and Roberto Talarita at Harvard. They've done research on many of the companies that signed a stakeholder capitalism commitment in 2019, and they found very little evidence that any of them were actually doing anything differently. So that, that's sort of one critique of ESG. The greenwashing critique. But then, again, there's the right wing critique, which is that, essentially it is real, it is affecting corporate behavior, and that companies, and especially investors, are much more reluctant to invest in or lend to politically incorrect aspects of the economy, which obviously includes energy, it includes oil, gas, and coal, but it's really bigger than that as well. It would include gun manufacturers, for example. And again, this is sort of a spectrum between greenwashing, fraud, essentially, and collusion, right? Like if you play the ESG game, you're essentially on that spectrum. You're somewhere in between them, right? Because either if you are really serious about it and you're cooperating with everyone to achieve this goal, and it's actually happening, then indisputably that has to be raising the cost of capital to the extent that it's actually happening on a systemic level for politically incorrect or ESG unfavorable industries. On the other hand, if that's not happening, if it's having no impact whatsoever on the cost of capital for those sectors of the economy, and it's all just, essentially marketing, then the left-wing critique of greenwashing starts looking really compelling. It's really hard to evade it. So that's really the problem for ESG advocates, and I think they're starting to realize this.
So that is a fascinating take, and I think there's even kind of a bigger issue here where we look at the behaviors of corporations and large institutions as large institutions, and we judge them increasingly on a sort of social ethics as opposed to traditional individual moral responsibility. And that I'm generally a person when it comes to economics and politics and public policy that says there's nothing new under the sun. Anything that appears to be new is probably just a reinterpretation of something that we've done a dozen times before. But I wonder if there's a certain like long-term change there. There's a fascinating quote which I put in a paper I wrote a couple years ago. So of course you, Russ, have read it. So it's from Peter Drucker, famed management guru, where he said about morality. He said, "To the moralist of the Western tradition, business ethics makes no sense. Indeed, the very term would be objectionable and reeking of moral laxity. All authorities of the Western tradition are in agreement on one point. There's only one ethics, one set of rules of morality, whatever that might be, one code of individual behavior with the same rules apply to everyone." So I wonder how that does apply to ESG, where we say, well, we're going to set a standard of business conduct for an industry, rather than say we're going to hold individual business leaders responsible for being moral and making ethical judgments.
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects of that question. First of all, I just completely disagree with Peter Drucker. I think anytime someone tries to like summarize the entire tradition of Western thought, they're probably going to run into some difficulties just right off the bat. Alexis de Tocqueville's concept of self-interest rightly understood comes to mind, right? The idea that me over the long term, if I want to achieve what's good for me, Russ Greene, I have to create value and create good relationships with other people. And that means necessarily often sacrificing my short-term best interest and what I want to do right now for what they would, prefer that I do. And therefore there is a sort of pro-social dynamic going on in commercial republics. That would be my first response to what Drucker's saying. But I think there's also a second question that you're raising, which is, is there anything new about ESG? Is it really just corporate social responsibility repackaged? We can all think back to the 1990s and 1980s. Before the term ESG existed, there was still this pressure, for example, not to invest in morally unjust parts of the world, like South Africa, for example, or not to invest in certain parts of the economy, like pornography companies, for example. So in that sense, ESG is not new, but ESG really, in my opinion, is markedly different from corporate social responsibility and previous iterations in one key way. And that is corporate social responsibility and all these prior iterations of sort of ethical investing never really contemplated this idea of global coordination and control, right? It was always about my portfolio or my company, right? I don't want to invest personally my money in causes that I disagree with, right? ESG is very distinct from that, because going back to the original ESG documents in like 2004 and 5, you can look at what they're contemplating, and they've always understood that it would require global coordination of capital allocation and capital regulation, right? It was always, first of all, understood that this had to be something that everybody was doing, and that it was not just a private sector initiative. So this is a really important point, because a lot of people are defending ESG right now, and they're saying it's just capitalism, it's just businesses are responding to what consumers want. That's 100% false. And I would even go so far as saying I think most people who claim that know that they're lying. Because, again, go back to the original ESG documents. They're publicly available online. One of them is called Who Cares Wins, for example. convened by the UN and Swiss government and a bunch of large banks. And you can read what they were talking about back then. And they understood that they were not just talking about how individual companies made their decisions or govern themselves. They're talking about what banks do, what asset managers do, but also, and this is very important, what public pensions do, how public pensions allocate their capital and how they engage with corporations, right? That is government action. And then also they understood that government regulators around the world would be required to incorporate ESG into how they regulate capital markets. So, from the beginning, it's been understood that this required global coordination and public-private partnership. In other words, central planning and cronyism.
Yes, and if that the public-private participation, it's not always a partnership. Sometimes sometimes it's coercion. But of course, even corporatist economic planning is itself an old thing, but
Yes.
with a sort of new kind of touchy-feely gloss on it. But that is a good point, that it's not just a handful of investment managers who happen to have ponytails and like the environment.
Yeah, and if I could get one point there too, so it's true as well. Samuel Gregg, among others, has made this point that stakeholder capitalism and ESG in general, in some ways, really resemble corporatism of 100 years ago or more. But correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think most of those previous ideas of corporatism, or even in practice, I don't think it was global, right? I think it was mostly nationally focused. So I still think that there's a key difference.
Yeah, definitely. When you have the look at either the worse, almost certainly worse, pre-World War II corporatism of a place like Mussolini's Italy, or the sort of much softer social corporatism of post-war West Germany. Those are almost all nationalist type outlooks. Perhaps not too different from what certain Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, populist national planning advocates might be interested in today.
Yeah, that's one of the ironies of this issue, is that ESG, maybe not if you call it ESG, but if you were to just say, like, we're going to reject shareholder primacy and we're going to insist that all companies should be required to pursue certain political and social objectives, if you were to frame it that way, you would actually find surprisingly many people on what's perceived to be the far right actually agree with progressives, right? This is one of those issues like antitrust and a couple others where there is this sort of horseshoe effect where, there's a surprising amount of agreement between populists and progressives. Which is actually kind of concerning from a political perspective, because, there's clearly an attempt being made to sort of build this potential coalition to mandate this sort of stakeholder capitalism or common good capitalism, whatever you want to call it, from the top down through the federal government. And, in my opinion, that would be disastrous.
Yeah, I've definitely taken a similar view of that. I know my colleague Jessica Malugin and I, who's a big antitrust and Federal Trade Commission expert, we wrote something a little while back about how, just like you described on antitrust, for example, there's a certain horseshoe theory with Elizabeth Warren on one side and then Josh Hawley on the other side, meaning in the middle, seemingly. But I have also sort of argued that it would be difficult. Well, it seems like if you're someone who doesn't like more aggressive antitrust enforcement, that sort of horseshoe theory seems like a threat, because both of them seem to be pro more antitrust. But the fact that they're in favor of it for different reasons,
Yes.
I think complicates it when you get to the point of, say, like writing a new law, trying to come up with a specific policy recommendation, which actually I think there's something you wrote about recently, or maybe mentioned on Twitter, which is, if you ask people, should corporations have policies in favor of the common good or something, something vague like that, so should corporations do good stuff? Well, yeah, you're going to have a very high poll result saying yes, 90% of Americans believe corporations should do good stuff. But once you start asking the specifics, well, which specific good thing should they be required to do, then you have that consensus breaks down a little bit, because if you ask people on the left and you say, oh, should every corporation guarantee that they will pay for an abortion for their female employees? Well, pro-choice people will say yes. Obviously, support for the pro-life side is going to die away a little bit when it comes to that particular proposal. And I think there's actually more of those than people might think, that the push for pro-social policy isn't as strong when we have to first agree on what pro-social means.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's two dimensions to this. One is what you said, which is just becoming more specific, right? Like, okay, you think corporations should, get involved in social and political issues since, you trust them more than you trust the federal government. I mean, I can kind of sympathize with that perspective. But then again, as you noted, as you get more specific on what social issues, what positions, when, what companies, right? Those percentages really start to fall. And I think it was the Brunswick group that did some polling on this issue, and they found that CEOs were about twice as likely as the general public to actually, when it came down to it, think that companies had a responsibility to be taking positions on these issues. But I think there's a second dimension, even beyond the specificity of it, which is trade-offs, costs. Right? If you introduce trade-offs into the equation, it becomes a lot more difficult to support the stakeholder capitalism ethos. Because, look, ask someone, do you support companies focusing more on social or political issues if it means that your 401k's value is going to decrease, right? Or if it means that your job might be at risk, or if it means that you have to pay more money at the grocery store this month, right? You start introducing those trade-offs, and I think, my guess would be that many people, if not everyone to be sure, but many people would change their minds. And that's significant because stakeholder capitalism and ESG advocates, they sort of tried to elide this question for a while. They tried to say, well, what's good for ESG is good for the world, is good for the company. Stakeholder capitalism really over the long term is just shareholder primacy, properly understood, kind of going back to Tocqueville, right? But I think it's becoming apparent that these trade-offs, do exist. They must exist, especially in this economic environment that we're in.
So that leads me to, I think, another interesting question, where one aspect of ESG, like you said, you mentioned stakeholder, the idea of stakeholder capitalism, is that traditionally companies have been focused on their shareholders and providing value to their shareholders. But now the premise is that a corporation must sort of understand or even cater to the interests of many stakeholder groups, both what I call like inner stakeholder groups, internal like your own employees, but also external stakeholder groups. So now that we have this long list of stakeholders that CEOs and managers and so forth boards are supposed to worry about, how do we decide who gets to be a stakeholder?
Yeah.
Do I just get to raise my hand and say, put me on the list of stakeholders? Or, for example, if you and I walked into ExxonMobil's corporate board meeting and we just told them, oh, by the way, Richard and Russ, we're stakeholders now. So put us on the list of people you have to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. In that regard, it's very similar to the problem with ESG that we mentioned earlier, right? Just defining it in an objective way is almost impossible. I would add to that, it's even if you try to define a stakeholder in an objective way, it can be useful, right? Like stakeholder analysis, I think, can be a useful tool for corporations, but it therefore negates most of what's distinctive about stakeholder capitalism as a broader idea. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at the most common definition of who's a stakeholder, right, going back to R. Edward Freeman, it's very confusing, by the way, that the stakeholder guy is Freeman and the shareholder guy is Friedman, right? Very confusing. We're having conversations about this topic. But if you go to what Freeman, R. Edward Freeman, actually says about who's a stakeholder, I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's something like a stakeholder is anyone who affects or is affected by, your company completing its mission, something like that, right? And if you take that definition, which, again, I think companies should be thinking about these questions. They should be thinking about, look, who are we going to affect and who affects our operations? Let's map that out so that we have a plan for it. I think that makes sense, right? But notice what's implicit in there, or even explicit in it. It's, while your firm is completing its mission, right? It's presuming that you have a mission above and beyond and separate from actually serving your stakeholders, right? So where's that mission coming from, right? Because what my corporate purpose is going to define who my stakeholders are. So it can't be that my stakeholders define my purpose if my purpose defines my stakeholders, right? And you get caught in this sort of like philosophical loop, or like this Zen cone of like, like purpose versus stakeholders that it's almost impossible to escape from, unless you have some purpose that's above and beyond simply, serving your stakeholders.
Well, yeah, I think there's really two different versions of this here. I know our old pal Steve Sokup, in his book, he wrote about the sort of origins of stakeholder like orientation, before people started talking about stakeholder capitalism per se, which is just that this is a sort of strategic planning exercise where you say, well, we just have to like figure out who is going to affect our business. Well, that's pretty, that's a sort of value neutral thing, right?
Yeah.
Just the people, these are the organizations, entities we interact with, and here's and we're gonna game play out what effect they're gonna have as we do our business going forward. But so that's the sort of something a management consultant might come in and say, okay, here's the variables you need to worry about. But that doesn't have any moral implication. That doesn't say these people are stakeholders, therefore you have to serve their interests above your own. Those are that, so the bigger leap, the conceptual leap to stakeholder capitalism and stakeholderism, some people call it, is a very big one, right? To say that like you need to be aware of the institutions you're interacting with is different from saying you need to prioritize their values above your own. Because one of the biggest, if you're looking at this again from a sort of strategic policy memo kind of perspective, well, some of the biggest people that affect you as a business are your competitors. Are your competitors now a stakeholder? But does that mean
Yeah.
you need to like serve their, like that doesn't make any sense.
I read one of the original like stakeholder capitalism books. When I say original, like from 45 years ago, I think it was by Freeman, and he literally lists terrorists as a potential stakeholder, right? Like if your corporation is threatened by terrorists, you have to consider them a stakeholder, which actually in the instrumental sense is true, right? You should be taking that into account if you have terrorists threatening your operations, but it certainly doesn't give them a moral claim, to your point, as a, as someone who somehow has priority over your shareholders or over whatever your corporate mission is.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably not going to invite the International Association of Terrorists to come to your board meeting every year. Probably. Well, maybe better in the tent than out of the tent. I know that's a strategic question. But so on a similar kind of a similar angle when it comes to organizations that aren't themselves corporate players but are part of sort of the operations society or also influential institutions, we are increasingly expecting big corporations, like you said, is sort of a difference that's rarely enunciated between smaller business and larger businesses. So generally, it's like big public corporations that we expect to have ESG goals and do prioritization of stakeholder groups.
Yeah, and by the way, that distinction is really important because there's way more small businesses than there are large businesses. So it's always a strange thing where we're talking about business in general, but we're actually talking about a minority of businesses, right? There's only, I forget exactly how many, I think it's 5,000 or 6,000 publicly traded companies in the United States. The number of total like registered businesses is in the millions, right? So most businesses are small businesses. So we need to discuss them. We want to actually discuss what's going on in business or what business's responsibility is.
Yeah, I think if you went to Philadelphia and you went to Patty's Pub, they would not have a high ESG rating.
Exactly. Yeah, they probably never even heard of the thing.
Potentially problematic. But if you look, if you go outside the sort of the corporate or even the business world, small or large,
and you look at some of the larger nonprofit institutions or foundations, they're never subject to ESG scores or ESG ratings or things like that. But should Greenpeace and the ACLU and NARAL and the Tides Foundation, should they have to submit sustainability reports and have ESG scores? Because a lot of people I know thinks that those groups have unleashed some negative externalities on society as well.
I mean, you introduce a very important point. So I actually haven't thought about charities very much in terms of ESG, but there is this discrepancy between who effects ESG outcomes, which is everybody in every organization, and who actually is affected by ESG pressure, which is predominantly publicly traded Western companies, right? Predominantly who ESG investors or ESG regulators like BlackRock or the Securities and Exchange Commission, who they're able to affect is the largest, mostly publicly traded companies. And that creates some pretty significant challenges for what they're hoping to accomplish or what they say that they're accomplishing. Because to the extent that they're putting pressure, right, on the ExxonMobils of the world, they're not able to put similar pressure on, Chinese state-owned enterprises, for example, or on even privately held companies in the West. There's still some mechanisms that they can use to exert pressure on privately held companies in the West, such as through banking services. Almost everyone has to use a bank. But that other point, those state-owned enterprises, whether Saudi Arabian or Russian or Chinese, that's a much bigger problem, because to the extent that Exxon is cutting its investments in future production or selling off even some of its assets, they're going somewhere, right? And that demand that's not going to be met by Exxon is going to be met by somebody else, right? So in many ways, what ESG is doing is just creating economic opportunities for other organizations that are less affected by ESG, which unfortunately tends to be, some of the most unethical companies and countries in the world.
Yeah, I haven't read Saudi Aramco's DEI policy. I'll have to go back and check that.
So that's what's funny about this, though. There is DEI. Like, they talk about these things in other countries, right? Like, I saw, I think Protocol had something about what DEI looks like in China, which is really strange, right? Like, since one ethnicity is so dominant there. But also, I've one of my hobbies is I listen to Arabic podcasts, and, very often, like the Arabic language economics or startup podcasts, they're talking about DEI in like Saudi Arabia and Dubai. So like, these concepts really they're not just an American thing. They are being applied elsewhere, but just in ways that, are kind of strange when viewed from an American perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess you could have a diversity initiative, certain percent Sunni employee, certain percent Shia employee. It would be different. Well, I have one more big question before we wrap up. So again, when it comes to corporations and what they should be doing or what it should be legal for them to do or how they should operate, my take has always been the old legal phrase that you should be able to operate a corporation for any legal purpose, and whether that means maximizing shareholder profit or something else, right? Whatever else that might be. But what I have a problem with in this area is changing the rules in the middle of the game. So, if you are already a public company or a big company, you've had people invest billions of dollars with you on the expectation, which has generally been the default in the United States, that they will prioritize your interests as shareholders and they'll work to produce profits for you. Isn't it sort of breaking that promise to suddenly say, oh, wait, well, actually, we're no longer shareholder driven anymore. We're now a stakeholder company and we're going to change the way we do things?
Yeah, it certainly seems like it to me, but I think a further wrinkle in this is that very oftentimes the stakeholder and ESG pressure is coming from actual shareholders, some of the largest shareholders, right? So that's one way in which the Friedman paradigm is being challenged these days. Is he sort of assumes in his writings that what most shareholders are going to care about at the end of the day is profits, you know. But it turns out that, you know, if you look at what many of the largest, you know, asset managers in the world are saying that they care about, it's, you know, these ESG things. So it really throws a wrench into the whole thing. But you know, there's several consequences of that. One is that the interests of some shareholders at a corporation might conflict with the interests of other shareholders at that corporation. And also, you know, you have the question of, you know, to the extent that BlackRock is actually managing but not owning assets, if it says that, you know, what it really wants a company to do is focusing on ESG goals, is it actually representing what its asset owners want, what its clients want? You know, that's kind of an open question, because, you know, it's not really possible for the people who are entrusting BlackRock with their money to be, you know, tracking in an extensive way what's going on at all these companies. They might not even know what ESG is. So, so yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, both at the company level and then at sort of the Wall Street or investor level. It's really an open question whether it's legal or ethical for someone to, like, overnight go from investing or engaging with a company towards one purpose to an entirely separate purpose.
All right. Well, that is those are some fascinating takes, Russ. We'll have to leave it there. One, thank you for being with us. But also, where can listeners hunt you down now that they know you are fascinating and want to read more?
Yeah, again, Richard, you're too kind. Well, I'm on Twitter, Greene plus an E, so Green plus an E, obviously referring to my last name. And I've written about this topic for a variety of outlets, but probably I would start at the National Review. That's where I've done my most recent work.
And LinkedIn, really the most fun and entertaining social media platform of all. See, I thought your Twitter was an ESG reference. I thought you were green plus E, even more environmental at the end.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. Okay. Well, thank you very
Well,
much.
one
Russ.
person said I should change my name, that I can't be Russ Greene anymore since I'm anti-ESG. I have to be Russ Brown. You know, I'm kind of upset about that, to be honest.
All right. Thank you very much. And this has been episode 5. We'll talk to you again soon, Russ.
Thank you.